Preston Whitaker delivered the sentence like he was announcing a weather forecast. Honestly, Wade, a rookie half your age could do this job better. He said it with that polished MBA grin, the one he'd perfected in some boardroom simulation seminar, and then he slid a manila envelope across the conference table like he was passing me a restaurant check. My name is Wade Sullivan. I'm 52 years old, and I've spent the last 14 years running plant operations at Halstead Precision Manufacturing, a company that fabricates hydraulic components for aerospace and heavy equipment. 14 years. That's how long I've been walking the same concrete floors, listening to the same CNC machines hum through the night shift, memorizing the personal quirks of every hydraulic press we owned. I knew which spindle in the number 3 cell drifted 0.002 degrees after 11 consecutive cycles. I knew which supplier in Wisconsin would ship us titanium blanks in 72 hours if I called their production manager directly and mentioned his daughter's name. Preston knew none of this. Preston knew how to make PowerPoint slides that pulsed with corporate synergy language, and he knew how to laugh at the right jokes when the regional director came to town. He'd been transferred to our facility 16 months ago from some consulting rotation, 29 years old, freshly minted from Wharton, and from the moment he walked onto our shop floor in his Italian loafers, he treated me like a fossil that hadn't figured out how to become extinct. "We're moving toward an agile talent model," he said, folding his hands on the table with practiced authority. "Younger, faster, cheaper. Someone who thinks in dashboards, not decades." He tapped the envelope. "Severance details are inside. Reasonable package, considering. We'd like you out by end of business today." I sat there for a long moment looking at him, not at the envelope, at him. His hair was gelled into a wave that suggested he'd spent more time in front of a mirror than most executives spent in front of quarterly reports. His watch was a Tag Heuer that probably cost more than my son's tuition semester. And his eyes had that particular flatness of a man who genuinely believed he had figured out something nobody else in the room understood. I didn't argue. I didn't beg. I've watched men beg in that chair before, and it never changed anything. Whatever Preston was doing, whatever presentation he was building for his next promotion cycle, my role in it had already been written and finalized weeks ago. This meeting was a formality, a checkbox, a moment for him to practice delivering hard news with corporate composure. "Understood," I said, and I stood up. His smile flickered. He'd expected something else. Anger, maybe, pleading. A speech about my contributions that he could dismiss with rehearsed sympathy. He hadn't expected calm. I walked out of the conference room, past the frosted glass wall where 2 associates pretended not to have been watching, and I went to my office. 14 years of accumulated life fit into a single cardboard box we used for shipping SEAL kits. A framed photo of Marisol and the boys at Yellowstone. A challenge coin the plant manager at Boeing had given me after we saved their AOG situation in 2019. A ceramic mug my daughter Alina had painted for Father's Day when she was 9. A stapler I'd owned longer than Preston had owned a driver's license. I carried the box out through the loading bay because I couldn't stand the thought of walking past reception. And that's when the phone in my pocket started to buzz. I set the cardboard box down on the tailgate of my Silverado and pulled the phone out, expecting Marisol. She had a sixth sense for these things, an uncanny ability to call at exactly the moment my day tilted sideways. But the screen didn't say Marisol. It said a number I hadn't seen in almost 3 years, and for a moment I just stared at it while the afternoon wind pushed dust across the parking lot. Nash Ferrante, the founder. Nash had started Halstead Precision Manufacturing in a 2-bay garage in 1987 with nothing but a used lathe, a second mortgage, and what his wife described in a company profile once as unreasonable stubbornness. He'd built the company from 3 employees to nearly 400, sold a controlling stake to a private equity group in 2019, and stepped back from day-to-day operations. He still held a board seat and a significant minority position, but he rarely came to the plant anymore. The last time I'd seen him in person was at the Christmas dinner 2 years back, where he'd shaken my hand and said, Wade, whatever they're paying you, it isn't enough. I answered on the fourth ring. Nash. Wade. His voice was gravel wrapped in warmth, same as always. Tell me I'm hearing things wrong. Tell me someone did not just walk you out of my building. I looked at the box on my tailgate. A corner of Alina's mug was poking through the top flap. I wasn't walked out, Nash. I walked out on my own. But the situation you're describing, yeah, that's accurate. There was a long pause on the other end. I could hear a fireplace crackling in the background and a dog somewhere farther off. Nash lived on a piece of ranch land about 40 minutes northwest of the plant, and I imagined him standing in that big stone-floored living room he'd shown me once back when he still hosted the senior team for barbecues. "Who did it?" he asked. "Preston Whitaker. The kid with the hair. That's the one." Another pause, longer this time. Then Nash said something very quietly that I'll remember for the rest of my life. "Wade, I want you to do me a favor. Don't sign anything. Don't cash anything. Don't respond to any HR email, any text, any voicemail from that building. Go home, kiss your wife, and come back to the plant tomorrow morning at 8. Nash, they've terminated me. I'm not sure walking back in is. 8 o'clock, Wade, front entrance. I'll be there." He hung up before I could answer. I stood in the parking lot for a long time after that, phone still warm in my hand, watching the American flag near the guard shack snap in the wind. 14 years of muscle memory told me to get in the truck, drive home, sit with my wife, and start updating my resume. But something in Nash's voice, some old iron underneath the calm, told me to do exactly what he said. I drove home slowly. Took the long way, past the reservoir and the old feed mill, giving myself time to think. When I pulled into the driveway, Marisol was standing on the porch with her arms crossed, and I could tell from her face she'd been watching for me. She had that way about her. She always knew. She walked down the steps, wrapped her arms around my neck, and said into my shoulder, "Tell me what happened, Wade. Tell me everything." So I did. Standing right there in the driveway with the cardboard box still in the truck bed behind me, I told her everything. Marisol didn't say much while I talked. She just held my hand and let me get through it. When I finished, she looked up at me with those steady brown eyes that had been my anchor for 27 years and said, "So the founder is meeting you at 8 in the morning." That's what he said. She nodded slowly, like she was fitting a piece into a puzzle only she could see. "Then you go at 8, and you wear the gray shirt, the one with the collar, not the polo, the button-down." That was Marisol. Practical. She could stand in a burning house and calmly hand you a fire extinguisher. Alina had inherited that from her, and our two boys, Cade and Wyatt, had inherited it in their own quieter ways. Cade was a junior at Colorado State, studying mechanical engineering. Wyatt was a senior in high school, working weekends at a bike repair shop and saving for community college in the fall. Alina, our youngest, was 14 and already talking about veterinary school like it was a foregone conclusion. We sat down at the kitchen table and Marisol poured 2 cups of coffee even though it was late afternoon. She always poured coffee when there was something serious to discuss. It was her ritual. "Whatever happens tomorrow," she said, "we're okay. You know that, right? We've got savings. We've got the equity in the house. Cade's aid package is solid. Wyatt's plan is realistic. Alina is fine. You are not the last wall holding this family up, Wade. You never have been. We built it together." I didn't cry, but I came close. 14 years of getting up before sunrise, of driving to that plant in blizzards and heat waves, of missing birthday dinners because a shipment needed to leave for a defense contractor in San Diego, and here was Marisol reminding me that the family had always been the point, not the paycheck. That night, I didn't sleep much. I lay in the dark listening to the house settle, thinking about what Preston had actually said. A rookie half your age could do this job better. It stuck in my chest like a splinter. Not because I was afraid it was true, but because I knew, with a bone-deep certainty, that it wasn't. Preston had no idea what my job actually was. He'd looked at my title on an organizational chart and assumed it was replaceable. He'd looked at my salary and assumed it was a line item that could be optimized. He had never once, in 16 months at that plant, walked the floor with me during a shift changeover. He had never sat in on a supplier negotiation. He had never watched me diagnose a hydraulic pressure loss in the number 4 cell by listening to the sound the pump made when it primed. That was the job, and you couldn't put that on a slide. At 5:30 in the morning, I got up, showered, and put on the gray button-down Marisol had laid out. I made her a cup of coffee, kissed her forehead while she was still half asleep, and I drove back to Halstead Precision Manufacturing. I got there at 7:52, 8 minutes early, which was the Wade Sullivan default. I parked in a visitor spot because parking in my old spot felt presumptuous, and I sat in the truck watching the front entrance. At exactly 7:58, a black Ford Expedition pulled into the lot and parked beside me. Nash Ferrante stepped out, wearing a canvas jacket over a flannel shirt, boots that had seen actual work, and an expression I could not read. He rapped his knuckles once against my window and said, "Let's go inside." We walked toward the front entrance together, and I noticed Nash wasn't hurrying. He was taking his time, letting his boots hit the pavement in a slow, deliberate rhythm, the way a man walks when he already knows how a conversation is going to end, and is giving the other people in the building time to feel it coming. Deborah at the front desk saw us through the glass and actually stood up. Deborah had been at Halstead for 19 years. She'd started as a receptionist before there was even a real reception area, back when the front door opened directly into the shop floor. She knew Nash the way you know a favorite uncle. Her hand went to her mouth when she saw him, and I watched her eyes flick between the two of us, calculating what this meant. "Mr. Ferrante," she said, opening the door for us. "I didn't know you were coming today." "Nobody did, Deb. Is Preston in his office?" "He is." "Should I let him know?" "No, thank you, Deb. We'll find him ourselves." She nodded, then she looked at me, and I saw something in her face that made my throat tighten. She wasn't surprised to see me back. She wasn't confused. She was relieved. That's the word for it. Like she'd been waiting for a shoe to drop and was glad to finally hear it hit the floor. We walked past the frosted glass conference room where Preston had delivered his rookie speech less than 24 hours earlier. We walked past the cubicles where a few early associates looked up over their monitors and then immediately looked back down. We turned the corner into the executive hallway, and Nash stopped just outside Preston's office. The door was open. Preston was on the phone, leaning back in his ergonomic chair, one loafer propped up against the corner of his glass desk, laughing at something. Nash knocked once on the doorframe. Preston looked up, and for a fraction of a second before his face rearranged itself into professional greeting mode, I saw the truth flash across his features. Confusion, then calculation, then a very specific kind of dread that starts in the stomach and works its way up. "Mr. Ferrante," he said, sitting up straight and dropping the phone into its cradle without saying goodbye. "This is a surprise. I wish I'd known. I would have prepared a Preston walk with me." "Sir, I have a call in 10 minutes with Preston. Walk with me." Preston stood up. His face had gone the color of a fluorescent ceiling tile. He glanced at me, standing behind Nash, and I watched him try to solve the equation in real time. Why was I here? Why was I not carrying my box? Why was the founder of the company standing in his doorway on a Wednesday morning without an appointment? Nash didn't wait for him to finish processing. He turned and started walking, and Preston followed, and I followed Preston, and the three of us made a slow procession down the executive hallway toward the main conference room. The one with the big oak table Nash had commissioned himself back in 2004 from a woodworker in North Carolina. The one where every major decision in the history of this company had been made. The conference room door was already open. And inside, seated around the table, were three people I recognized immediately. Bernadette Halpern, the head of HR, Owen Chastain, the CFO, and a man I'd only met once before, Regis Aldana, the private equity partner who chaired the board. None of them were smiling, and all of them were looking at Preston. Nash gestured to two empty chairs at the far end of the oak table. "Wade, take a seat. Preston, you too." Preston sat down like his legs had stopped believing in themselves. He kept his hands flat on the table, which is what people do when they're trying to look composed and instead look like they're bracing for impact. I sat across from him, and I made myself keep my hands relaxed. Marisol had told me once, years ago, that the way you sit in a room tells everyone whether you belong there. I had decided in the truck that morning that I belonged in this room. Nash didn't sit. He walked to the head of the table, rested his knuckles on the polished oak, and looked at Preston for a long moment before speaking. Preston, yesterday afternoon at approximately 2:15, you terminated the employment of Wade Sullivan, our Director of Plant Operations. Is that correct? Preston opened his mouth, closed it, and opened it again. Sir, that was a workforce optimization decision that I ran through the appropriate. Yes or no, Preston? Did you terminate Wade Sullivan yesterday afternoon? Yes. Did you have authority to terminate a director-level employee unilaterally, without board notification, without CFO sign-off on the severance package, and without HR completing an exit review? Bernadette Halpern shifted very slightly in her chair. Owen Chastain didn't shift at all. Regis Aldana, the private equity partner, was writing something in a small leather notebook and did not look up. Preston's mouth worked for a moment before words came out. The termination was within the scope of my divisional authority as, your divisional authority, Nash said, is capped at operational staff up to grade 7. Wade is a grade 11. You knew that. Bernadette sent you the delegation matrix in your onboarding packet 16 months ago. She sent it again in January when she updated the framework. She sent it a third time when you asked her about consolidating the shipping supervisors. So I'm going to ask you again. Did you have the authority to terminate Wade Sullivan? Preston stared down at his hands. No, sir. Speak up, Preston. No, sir, I did not. Nash nodded slowly as if this confirmed something he'd already known. Then he pulled out a chair and finally sat down. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter and somehow that made it heavier. Preston, I want you to understand something. I'm not upset because you exceeded your authority. Authority can be adjusted. I'm upset because of who you exceeded it against and why. Do you know what Wade Sullivan actually does at this company? Preston hesitated. He oversees plant operations, coordinates production. That's his title. I'm asking what he does. I don't understand the question, sir. Of course you don't, Nash said, and there was something almost sad in the way he said it. That's the problem. He turned to Owen Chastain. Owen, would you walk Preston through the numbers you pulled for me last night? Owen opened a manila folder in front of him. He was a lean, deliberate man in his early 60s who'd been the CFO since the year the company went from 30 employees to 80. He put on his reading glasses. In the past 4 fiscal years, the operational unit under Wade's direction has delivered a cumulative cost variance of $3.1 million under budget, while increasing throughput 22%. Our defect rate per 1,000 units dropped from 4.7 to 1.2. Our on-time delivery to the top 5 customers has been at or above 98% for 17 consecutive quarters. He looked up over his glasses at Preston. That is what Wade does at this company. Preston didn't respond. There was nothing to respond with. Numbers like that don't leave room for spin, and spin was the only tool Preston had ever brought to work. Nash let the silence sit for a beat longer than was comfortable. Then he leaned forward on his elbows and continued. Preston, when I started this company in 1987, I did it because I believed that manufacturing was a craft, not a spreadsheet, a craft. And I built this place on the idea that the people who actually understand the work, the ones who can walk onto a floor and hear when a machine is about to fail, the ones who know a supplier's kid's name, those people are the company. Everything else, the branding, the org charts, the quarterly optimization frameworks, all of it exists to support them, not the other way around. He turned his head and looked at me for the first time since we'd sat down. His eyes were tired, but there was something underneath the tiredness that I recognized as anger, not the loud kind, the other kind. Wade is one of those people. He has been one of those people for 14 years, and you looked at his salary line and decided he was a rounding error you could remove to make your division metrics look sharper for a promotion cycle. Is that fair, Preston? Is that an accurate summary of what happened yesterday? Preston's mouth had gone dry. I could see him swallow. Sir, my intent was to modernize. I don't care about your intent, I care about your judgment. And your judgment, Preston, is not what we need in this building. Regis Aldana, the private equity partner, finally set down his pen. He'd been silent the whole meeting, but now he cleared his throat and everyone at the table turned to him. That's how boardroom hierarchy works. The quiet one gets the last word. "Mr. Whitaker," Regis said. His voice was very calm, very East Coast, very final. "The fund I represent holds a majority position in this company, and we take that position seriously. When Mr. Ferrante called me last night at 9:40 in the evening and walked me through what had happened, I made a phone call to my managing partner. Then we made a decision. Would you like to hear it?" Preston nodded because he had nothing else to do. "Your employment with Halstead Precision Manufacturing is terminated, effective immediately. Bernadette will handle the paperwork. Security will accompany you to your office to collect personal items. You will not have access to company systems, company data, or company premises after today. Are we clear?" Preston made a sound that wasn't quite a word. Then he said, "Yes. We're clear." "Additionally," Regis continued, "the board has retained outside counsel to review 3 specific matters. The workforce optimization report you circulated in January, which we now have reason to believe misrepresented certain personnel data. The vendor consolidation proposal you submitted in March, which included a supplier relationship your family has an undisclosed financial interest in. And the termination package you offered Mr. Sullivan yesterday, which appears to have been structured in a way that would have released the company from certain obligations that legally cannot be released. We will be in touch through counsel." Preston went very still. I don't think he'd been expecting the last part. Neither had I. Nash had done his homework overnight, and he'd done it thoroughly. Bernadette stood up. "Preston, if you'll come with me." He rose slowly, like a man in a dream, and followed her out. He did not look at me on his way past. The door closed behind them, and for a moment the conference room was completely silent. I could hear the ventilation system humming somewhere overhead, and the faint sound of a forklift beeping out on the shop floor, doing what shop floors do while executives sort out their messes upstairs. Nash exhaled and leaned back in his chair. Owen closed his manila folder. Regis picked his pen back up and made another note. Then Nash turned to me. "Wade, I owe you an apology." I shook my head. "Nash, you didn't do this. Preston did this. I let Preston into this building. I signed off on the private equity structure that put people like him in decision-making positions. I stepped back 3 years ago because I told myself the company was ready to be run by professionals. Turns out, professionals is not the same word as leaders. That one's on me." He paused, then he looked me straight in the eye. "I'd like you to come back to work. Not to the same role, to a different one. I'd like you to take over as vice president of operations for the entire company. All 3 plants, not just this one. Owen and I have already talked about the compensation package. Bernadette is drawing up the paperwork. Regis has signed off on the board's behalf. The role reports directly to the CEO, and the CEO reports to the board. Preston's chair is empty, and the chair above his is also empty because we haven't found the right person yet. But that's a conversation for another quarter." I sat there for a long moment. Vice President of Operations, 3 plants, direct report to the CEO. 14 years ago, when I'd started at Halstead as a shift supervisor, I would have laughed at anyone who told me this conversation was going to happen. 10 years ago, when I made director, I would have quietly hoped for it. 5 years ago, when the private equity deal closed and everything changed, I would have written it off as impossible. And yesterday afternoon, standing in the parking lot with a cardboard box on my tailgate, I would have called it a fantasy. But sometimes life doesn't ask what you thought was possible. It just hands you the next thing and waits to see what you do with it. "Nash," I said, "I need to talk to Marisol before I say yes." He smiled for the first time that morning. "Wade, that is exactly the right answer. Take today, take tomorrow, take the weekend if you need it. The chair will be here Monday." Regis stood up and extended his hand across the table. "Mr. Sullivan, I look forward to working with you. And I want to say on behalf of the fund that yesterday was not a reflection of how we view your contribution. We are aware of what you've built here. That's why we made the phone calls we made last night." I shook his hand. His grip was firm, dry, and brief. "New York firm. Owen shook my hand next, and he held onto it a second longer than necessary, the way old colleagues do when they don't quite know how to say what they mean. "Good to have you back, Wade," he said. Nash walked me out to the parking lot. We didn't say much on the way. When we got to my truck, he clapped a hand on my shoulder and said, "Go home, kiss your wife. Come back Monday." Then he turned around and walked back inside. I stood there in the parking lot for a long time. I drove home the long way again. Past the reservoir, past the feed mill, taking corners slower than I needed to because my head was too full to move any faster. The morning sun was climbing over the ridge east of town, and the light on the road looked different than it had 24 hours ago. Same road, same light, technically. But something in me had shifted, and shifted things look different, even when they haven't changed at all. Marisol was in the kitchen when I walked in, cutting apples for Alina's school lunch even though Alina was already at school. It was a nervous hands thing. She looked up when the door opened and I saw her scan my face, doing that thing she does where she reads 5 things about my day before I've said a single word. "Well," she said, "sit down." She set the knife down and sat at the table. I sat across from her, took her hands in mine, and I told her everything. Nash walking in with me. Preston's face when the door opened. Owen reading out the numbers. Regis Aldana quietly ending Preston's career in 3 sentences. Nash's offer. Vice President of Operations. 3 plants. Direct report to the CEO. She listened without interrupting, which is not her usual mode. Marisol is a talker, a questioner, a challenger. But when something matters, she goes very still and lets you finish. When I was done, she squeezed my hands and asked the only question that mattered. "Do you want it?" I thought about it, really thought about it. Not the money, though the money would be significant. Not the title, though the title would be meaningful. I thought about the actual work. Walking 3 plant floors instead of 1. Sitting in board meetings. Building the kind of operational culture Nash had built in 1987, but at scale. And this time from a seat where nobody could dismiss me over a manila envelope. "I do," I said. "But only if you do." She smiled then. That slow smile that starts in her eyes and takes its time getting to her mouth. "Wade, I have been watching you carry that plan on your back for 14 years. I've watched you get up at 4 in the morning because a shipment was delayed. I've watched you drive out there on Christmas Eve because a machine broke down. I've watched you swallow every insult that boy Preston threw at you for a year and a half because you thought staying quiet was what a professional did. If you're asking me whether I want you to take the job where they actually respect you, Wade, yes, take the job." That was it. That was the whole conversation. 27 years of marriage, and sometimes the biggest decisions get made in under 2 minutes at a kitchen table. I called Nash that afternoon. He didn't sound surprised. He said, "Monday, 8 o'clock, same parking lot, different chair." The rest of that week felt like a dream I hadn't quite woken up from. I told Cade over the phone, and he was quiet for a moment before he said, "Dad, that's huge. I'm proud of you." I told Wyatt at dinner, and he grinned and said, "Does this mean you're going to buy me a truck?" I told Alina, and she looked up from her homework and said very seriously, "Does this mean we can get a dog?" Marisol laughed harder than I'd heard her laugh in months. On Sunday night, I laid out the gray button-down again. Monday morning, I got to the plant at 7:45, and Deborah at the front desk stood up again when she saw me walk in, but this time she was smiling so hard she couldn't quite hide it. She had a small paper bag on her desk, and she pushed it toward me as I walked past. "Blueberry muffin," she said, "from the bakery on 3rd. I got one for Nash, too. He's already in the conference room." "Deb," I said, "you didn't have to do that. Wade, I have been waiting for a good day at this company for a long time. Let me have my muffin moment." I laughed. It was the first real laugh I'd had inside that building in longer than I could remember. Nash was in the conference room with Owen and Bernadette. There was a folder waiting for me at the head of the table, and inside it was the employment agreement, the compensation summary, the equity grant details, and a 1-page document titled Statement of Role. Nash had written it himself. I could tell from the phrasing. It wasn't lawyer language, it was Nash language. I signed everything. Bernadette notarized it. Owen shook my hand and said, "Welcome to the leadership team, Wade." Nash didn't shake my hand. He just nodded at me once, and I understood exactly what that nod meant. The next 3 months were the busiest of my career. I visited the 2 other plants in the first 2 weeks. The one in Amarillo was in reasonable shape, but had a supplier problem that had been quietly bleeding margin for 2 years, because the previous VP had been afraid to renegotiate a contract with a family friend of the CEO. I fixed it in 6 weeks. The one in Chattanooga was worse. Preston had actually spent time there before his transfer to us, and his fingerprints were everywhere. A workforce optimization program that had cut the wrong 12 people, a vendor consolidation that had locked them into inferior steel from a single supplier, a quarterly reporting cadence that had operations chasing dashboards instead of running production. I spent 11 days on the floor in Chattanooga, walking every shift, listening to every foreman, and by the end of that trip I had a 90-day recovery plan that Nash approved on the first read. The board took notice. Regis Aldana called me directly in the middle of the second month to ask a few questions about the Chattanooga plan, and at the end of the call he said, "Mr. Sullivan, the fund is very pleased with what we're seeing." Coming from Regis, that was the equivalent of a marching band. I hired an assistant, a woman named Priya Ramaswamy, 34 years old, industrial engineer by training, sharp as a tack. She reminded me of myself at that age if I'd had a better degree and more confidence. I told her on her first day, "Priya, my job is to teach you everything I know, and your job is to eventually take my chair. That's how this works." She looked at me like she wasn't sure whether to believe me. By month 3, she believed me. Meanwhile, stories about Preston filtered in through the industry grapevine. He'd landed briefly at a consulting firm in Dallas, then left after 2 months. Then a stint at a manufacturing outfit in Phoenix that ended even faster. The outside counsel Regis had hired had found things in Preston's Halstead paperwork that were now, apparently, matters of interest to a regulator in a state I won't name. I didn't take any joy in it. I'd stopped needing to. By the end of my first year as Vice President of Operations, Halstead Precision Manufacturing had posted the strongest operating results in the company's history. Cost variance across 3 plants came in $4.8 million under consolidated budget. Defect rates in Chattanooga dropped from 6.1 per 1,000 units to 1.9. The Amarillo supplier renegotiation added $1.3 million in annualized margin. On-time delivery to our top 10 customers hit 99.1%, a company record. I say those numbers not because they matter in themselves, but because they were the answer to a sentence Preston Whitaker had said in a conference room 14 months earlier. "A rookie half your age could do this job better." Every quarterly report I signed was a quiet rebuttal to that sentence. Not for Preston. Preston no longer mattered. For me. For every 52-year-old who has ever been told they were a line item. Nash stepped fully back from the board in the spring, and Regis Aldana asked me to sit for an interview with the board's succession committee. 6 weeks after that, they offered me the Chief Operating Officer role. I accepted. Marisol and I celebrated with steak at a small restaurant downtown, and she squeezed my hand across the table and said, "I always knew, Wade, I always knew." I brought Priya up with me. She took over as Vice President of Operations, and she was ready for it because I had spent every day of the previous year preparing her for it. That's what succession is supposed to look like. Not a manila envelope and a cardboard box. A patient handoff from someone who understands the work to someone who is learning it. We hired 6 people from other companies in that first year, and 3 of them were former Halstead employees who had left during the Preston era. Word travels in manufacturing. People remember which buildings treat them like humans and which ones treat them like line items. Deborah stayed at the front desk. She said she had no interest in being promoted, and I understood exactly what she meant. Some people find the exact shape of the job they want and they don't want it to change. Deborah's muffin runs remained a fixture of the executive floor. Cade graduated from Colorado State that spring. Wyatt started at community college in the fall, and by his second semester he was talking about transferring to a 4-year engineering program. Alina did not get a dog. She got 2 dogs. Marisol said it was because I was never home to say no, but she was smiling when she said it. One evening in late autumn, I was sitting on the back porch watching the sun go down behind the ridge and my phone rang. It was Nash. "Wade. How's the chair?" "It's a good chair, Nash. I heard the Chattanooga numbers, that's craftsmanship. Learned from the best." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Wade, I want you to know something. That morning I called you in the parking lot. I was on the phone with Regis by 9:30 the night before. But before I called Regis, I called my wife and I told her what had happened. And she said to me, 'Nash, that man built you a company. Go build him a chair,' that's what she said." I didn't have words for a moment. Then I said, "Tell her thank you, Nash." "I already did." She said, "Tell Wade to keep showing up." That's what I do. Every morning at 7:45. Gray button-down, same parking lot. If this story moved you, please like, share, and subscribe for more stories about the people who quietly hold everything together and the moments when the world finally notices.